broadcasting from deepest, darkest Mexico. And I'd like to introduce my first guest, the channel's first guest, a man called NeoVictorian from Alaska, who's written 2 novels. I discovered NeoVictorian on the Twitter. I'm quite new to Twitter, but there's a lot of activity there that's red-pilled oriented and fiction oriented, and sometimes they overlap. And that's what drew my attention to him. And I'd like to ask Neo if you would just introduce yourself and give a bit of background to who you are, where you're from, and what it was that drew you to writing a red-pilled fiction book.
Well, thank you, Richard. Yeah, up here in Alaska, it's snowing right now outside and all that good stuff. You know, I've been on Twitter for a few years, and someone tweeted something about, you know, who's going to be the Tom Wolfe of the red-pilled, you know, speaker or whatever, you know, the word is. And so that was funny because I had wanted to write a book for a long time. And it sort of set me off. And I wrote a few hundred words or something like that. And that's what got me going to write the first book and the second.
How long ago was that, you say?
Oh, about 3 years ago. It was 2017, early. It took me a year to write a 68,000 word book. So I'm not exactly the most rapid.
Oh, don't worry. That's pretty rapid by my standards. I'm often on the first page after a year. And can you describe how the process went of writing? Because you obviously knew to, a lot of us red-pilled writers have come to the profession, if you want to call it that, because we're frustrated with the absence of books for ourselves to read. We're often not professional writers to start with. We have other sidelines or a main line, main jobs, and it is a sideline. So you just leapt into it feet first, and how did it go? How did you find the whole writing process?
Well, my process is a little different, I think, than a lot of people. I didn't have a whole storyline. I didn't have the details of events in mind when I started. I only had a few scenes, basically a couple scenes. I wrote them down, and things went on from there. The story sort of developed on its own over time. You know, the whole structure.
Very good. Now, you've mentioned Tom Clancy in passing, but who are the writers? And in your books, actually, you mentioned several of your influences within the text, of the main text of the novels, including John Buchan, Ayn Rand, and mainly Robert Heinlein. Were any of those instrumental in you starting your books, or did that come slightly afterwards?
You know, it's funny because the very first thing I wrote was kind of inspired by the idea of Raymond Chandler, of that this guy goes to his office, like a private eye office, early one morning, and something's waiting for him, some big surprise. And so the you know, the scene about it being, you know, he's not a detective, but this scene of going to your office and finding some dame there, very Raymond Chandler like. So that was what got me going for a scene or two, and it just developed from there. You know, I had a lot of ideas already in mind about, you know, the grand conspiracy that runs the world, whatever that exists, whatever form it does or doesn't exist in. You know, it's a theme for a lot of good literature over the years, you know. And John Buchan, I mean, for example, someone who I hadn't read till a couple of years ago, when I finally got it, you know, to read his books, I was like, oh yeah, you know, the powerhouse in, you know, written in the 1920s, it already has the whole theme of a secret, very, you know, secretive organization of highly qualified people. I mean, for good or evil, whatever, you know. And so I had started the books before I read that, but that's one author that really fit in with the vision I had without ever having read him before.
That's funny you should say it. I know you've read my book, and I named my hero after John Buchan. And he as a writer, the writer John Buchan had an exact same impact on me when I read him. It was a while ago now, but he was not only one of the first thriller writers, which makes him special by any measure, but he integrated some subtle political themes, but very important ones, and he didn't duck any issues into his novels as well, which makes him very interesting as well. And the fact that it's a skill of integrating the thriller with the political that maybe didn't die with him exactly, but it's certainly not a common thing to see when you account for all the books that are published in the world every year. It's a very rare combination, and one I think that deserves bringing back to life to an extent, and which is why I reference him in my books, and so do you in yours, I'm sure. What about some of the other writers you've credited? I'm not familiar with. We've got Thomas Pynchon, Robert Share, and Robert Anton Wilson on your list.
Yes. Well, Pynchon is the American writer. You probably have heard his name, perhaps.
I read Gravity's Rainbow in honest.
Oh, you read Gravity's Rainbow? Okay. So,
yeah, but I was 20 when I did this, and it's a long time ago.
Well, I've been rereading V recently, his first book, and it reflects some of just this hint of what I've got in Sanity and Reality, that, a little bit disjointed timelines are combined with, mysterious circumstances, historical conspiracies, all that kind of mixed together. It's in the book, his first novel as well.
And the other two, Robert Share, Robert Anton Wilson, I don't know them at all.
They wrote Illuminatus in the 1970s. It was a fairly popular cult type book among libertarians in the U.S., conspiracists, and a lot of other people. For quite a few years in the 70s and 80s, a lot of people had read the book.
Okay, well, conspiracies and secret societies and so on brings us nicely to we're going to talk about two books today, as you've just mentioned them, Sanity and Reality. Would you just give us a little introduction to them? I'm going to then go into your style and so on, but just basically, how do they gel together? Why did you separate it into two books, and so on?
Well, honestly, I wrote the first book, and I just wanted to get through and finish that book. I did not write it with any sequel in mind, very much, if at all. And so they're both the story in first person, present tense, which I think is kind of important. The way the stories come off, they're all about Cal Adler. They're all from his point of view, first person present through the whole thing. So the idea with that I really like, in other books that have used that, which are not that many, I think, in certain genres, hardly anybody uses, almost everyone uses a third person narrative type thing. So the only thing you ever see is through his eyes in both books, and the time events are not sequential. And that's something I basically got from the, Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. In this Illuminatus, they took a 1,000-page novel and just grabbed sections of it and then, moved it to a different spot in the book.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I've done here. Is the whole thing's told, episodes. There's kind of a smooth transition in the first half of the book, some scenes that are sequential, but then it jumps back and forth 3 years basically for the second half of the book. And I really liked that, that touch. And most people have said it's okay with them, who have read the book. A few didn't like it. But generally the chapters or the scenes are so short that, that you can easily remember what happened. I mean, you read the book, Richard, so You probably
Yeah,
didn't
I'll,
lose track of things.
you described it to me in an earlier correspondence, your style, as somewhat strange and esoteric and frankly weird, with a non-linear timeline and using flashback sequences to eventually tie it all together, and that sums it up very well. It is a distinct, from my reading experience, I haven't, I've maybe read a few books in similar style, but I don't, it would have been a while ago now. But I will say that although it is a bit disjointed, it forces the reader to focus very tightly on each scene in a way that is remarkably intense. I'm not sure if that was the original intention, but it's rather like looking at a series of photo snapshots rather than a piece of film, which combined with your eye for detail, which I think is extraordinary, and your way of evoking almost a stream of consciousness from the main character, Cal, especially in scenes of violence and sex, I've got to say, is very, very attractive and very, it's a bit demanding of the reader, but it's very rewarding as well. Reminds me a little bit of funny that you called yourself Neo-Victorian, because it's a bit like Neo in The Matrix, where time slows down, details become very real and vibrant, and even the scene around him slows down as well. And I think you pull it off remarkably well. So I would recommend the books very strongly on those strengths. It's quite an experience. The first pages of the first novel of yours that I read, which was Sanity, and it happens again when you open Reality, are mesmerizing, spellbinding, and it's quite dramatic, the effect. And I congratulate you, because I wish it's an effect that most writers, I think, like to evoke, but not always can. Why did you put them into two books then? Was it just the case of you'd written one and then you wanted to add some more? Or was it that you felt the stories needed to be somewhat separate? Because they are two parts of the same story, ultimately. It's like book one and book two. You could have joined them together, but you didn't.
You know, I honestly, like I say, I wasn't really thinking of a second book. So some people said they really liked the book and hoped there was more, that they reached the end of the book and they wished there were more. And that's, an author hearing that is motivated to produce something. But I did have a few, I had ended the book with a few questions. First book, it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't have the usual type of ending, I guess, in a way. Some people said, it's like the end of the second act. A couple people told me, there's supposed to be 3 acts, and there's a whole formula, for thriller writing to a certain extent. And I was trying to play with that, ignore it sometimes, and just end the book with, sort of that maybe it's worth going on and doing another one or not. Who knew at the time? But I got going on the second book, and the first third of the second book is like kind of a self-contained story that so that makes it somewhat different in structure and everything. And but like I say, one of the most interesting things is telling things from the first person like this. That there's so much that we never know about, years. There are different years that have gone by that there's absolutely no comment about several years in his life, and I found that effect fascinating, and I hoped people would. The negative spaces, that go through the whole thing, since it's not a linear narrative, in a linear narrative type of detective story or whatever, there are certainly some spaces where they skip over a day or an hour or a few minutes, but in those types of stories, they never have, a bunch of things that happen 12 years apart or whatever normally. And so I was trying to subvert the genre a little bit with some of these things. um, you know, and make it a little bit different, because it really is. It was supposed to be originally sort of a detective story, and
Yeah.
it has some of that in it, but it kind of mutated.
On that issue, would you tell us a little bit about the outfit, you call it, and the sort of superstructures involved in the novel, and rehumanism is a theme you bring up, which I found fascinating, because we've all heard of transhumanism and other types of humanism, but rehumanism, as far as I know, is your own invention, and maybe a couple of the other themes and how they interact in the structure of the novel.
Yeah, you know, rehumanism is my invention. I mean, I'm surprised no one else thought of it before me, but I don't ever recall seeing
They have.
Yeah, and it's you know, I won't say too much about it. We'll leave a little mystery, here, but it is a bit of a play on Scientology, which is something I know a lot about, but it's also a serious philosophical, position, I guess, basically about what's usually called, evolutionary mismatch, where our bodies are still basically geared toward at least a few thousand years ago, the conditions then and the conditions we live in now. A lot of people don't take them very well, and that's why we got obesity and these kind of things, in my opinion.
Yes, I agree.
This evolutionary mismatch, and so you've got to try to change that. And the idea is there are technologies and systems and methods that can help with these things, and that's what Scientology presented itself to be.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Scientology, but I believe you.
Yeah, a lot of listeners probably will be at least familiar with the with something about it anyway. But the outfit is the one I have the most fun with, because that's always been the term the mafia preferred to call themselves, the American specific mafia. They
Yep.
And it's basically, to give credit where credit's due. Robert Heinlein, who you may or may not have read.
Yes, I have.
You have read him, okay.
Yes.
So in his story Gulf, the guy, that was an inspirational story for mine. The guy is a future super CIA agent, basically, and he stumbles, into this thing where he finds out that there is an organization like the outfit, where a very small number of people, have gotten together to try to make things better in the world, and they think operating completely secretly is the best way to do that. So those are some things, that are major players in the way the book goes.
And Cal obviously is the hero who is recruited to pit him, and eventually pits himself against, on behalf of the good guys, against the outfit. He's like how would you describe him? It's difficult. He's not a detective anymore. He's a noisier hitman, exactly. But
well, he really just wanted to be an electrical engineer,
Yeah.
But he goes to school for that. But events, afterward, cause him to not become a practicing electrician. He does, I'd like to say, go to work at a mine, starting at the bottom. And that's something I've always been interested in. We have some mines around here where I live, abandoned shafts and so on. And there's a scene in the book, or some scenes, where that comes into play, that, dug down a mine shaft. And I've been down these things, and it's pretty interesting, the whole,
Yeah, he reminds me a little bit of an Ayn Rand character in that sense, a Howard Rourke type who has no pretensions or illusions of superiority, very down to earth, very talented, and the right man for the job, as it turns out, but humble in many ways. So it's a nice combination. He does have to resort to violence on certain occasions, sometimes very graphically and very suddenly. What are your views on violence? Because you do dwell on it somewhat, and it's a sort of theme that recurs. That preemptive violence can be justified in many cases. It would seem to be the message I got. You don't have to be reactive only.
And that's in your book as well. I'll just say, I think the idea, I hadn't read your book when I started writing mine, or until I was finished with it. But the idea that you have some kind of agency that does what has to be done, and everything is, I think that it's something probably out there, in the real world. It's not just a fictional thriller, thing. I believe that there are organizations, in the government that are a little bit like the ones that we have written about.
Trouble is, the current government organizations are probably working against the good guys rather than on their behalf. But,
yeah. So the idea that the main idea is that these that these people are sort of standing between us and the
abyss,
things that would happen. Yeah, and the abyss, the bad things that will happen if people like this if there's not enough of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really George Orwell's thing about how the rough man in the trenches is protecting your easy way of life back there in England.
So you can sleep at night. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I truly believe there's something to that. So Cal Adler gets picked out to be one of these people, and it's what would you do with that? That's the funny thing, because in real life, I suppose you might have some recruitment failures and so on, but if you look at the true at real history, look at Kim Philby, for instance. Kim Philby was recruited into the British Secret Service, got access to the highest levels of secrets. He was a Russian spy. So how do organizations avoid that? I mean, no one has always avoided it. Every Secret Service, the Russians, the Americans, everyone had sometimes rodden with spies, and it was a lot harder to spy on the Soviets than it was to spy on the Americans. But the Americans managed to get defectors and tap the phones and all those kind of things. Yeah. So, the idea that if you don't want any publicity or anything like that, you can hide something within something else is a real one. It's been done in government many times. So
sure.
That's so there's some of that. But going back, I mean, I got a little off the track perhaps on that, but I think one of the things you mentioned was during scenes of violence, I mean, I tried consciously to have a different writing style, or it's the use of punctuation is considerably reduced and that kind of thing, and just the description of things, because I've been in some situations, maybe you have too, where there is a sudden emergency, and that was my feeling at the time. It's like everything slowed down, and I experienced like exceptional clarity, and I think that can be trained. That's the whole purpose of military training.
Yeah.
Basically. And that happened to me somewhat naturally, I guess. When there's a fire, when I was a kid, as well as someone choking to death, and I remember this feeling of slowing down and of being very focused, and that's something that you read about. It's in my book a bit, and it's one of the most important things that nobody teaches. They don't teach it at school.
No. It's part of the rehumanizing theory, I suppose, in a way. It's a kind of element within the big picture,
Yeah.
of preparing us for this different world we're in and strengthening the abilities we need and skills. Cal is obviously a very intelligent character. He's at Stanford, electrical engineering, brilliant, top of his class type. But he's also physically an impressive character. He's tall, he's very strong, and when it's demanded of him, his body can deliver. What do you? There was I sensed a theme there that because other people that he works with are similarly endowed. They're either super. Well, they're good looking, but you don't make any, you don't hesitate with it, or it's not something you're embarrassed about. It seems you're quite proud of the fact that these are not superhumans, but they're of a certain physiology and physiognomy. Am I right in thinking that was a deliberate?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I was just using what I feel are established scientific facts. Intelligence and physical attractiveness are correlated. It's not the whole dumb blonde thing, or all these beautiful that beautiful women are very smart, or whatever. It's just not true as far as I'm concerned. I think it's the opposite, and that's a scientific fact, basically.
Yeah, it's good to see it. It's nice to see it in the reality of, even if it's fictional reality, in this day and age where really it's being purposely downplayed by everybody in the mainstream. The new James Bond would be a good example. The themes are going undercurrents in the new James Bond film and where it's likely to lead. It's quite nice to see someone proudly observing it and demonstrating it as traits. I'm going to read a quote here from the second novel, which is called Reality. I want the reader to get, the listener today, to get an idea of your writing style. I've deliberately selected a passage which addresses an element of the political side of your writing. There aren't many, and it's all very subtly done. So this was one of the few that I thought encapsulates where you're coming from, and it's a very good passage too. Cal is in Utah, and he's entered a small town which exists. I looked it up, called Delta, Utah. I take it you've been there, or?
No, I haven't actually been there. I will say I've been to almost all of the places in the book are from personal description. Most
Right.
a couple I have not been to, and I relied on Google Maps and photos.
Well,
and
that's fine. You're using it as a generic middle American town, not very big. And anyway, I'll try and do my best to read it fairly for you.
Okay.
He's just pulled in, and the sign at the city line said, "Entering Delta, Utah, population 3,686. Most of them probably go to church on Sunday. I have a flash of what it would be like to settle here. No stress-filled hour-long commute to a steel glass box. No evening news reports of convenience store clerks robbed and pistol-whipped. Sleeping children struck by stray bullets. No politics beyond the school board elections. No battling the order, which are the bad guys, and the world historical fights to preserve Western civilization. This is Western civilization. Ordered liberty, and a man's home is his castle, and they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. Except all the while, in the cities choked with sin and resentment and childlessness, others are on their laptop keyboards spewing their hatred of this place. Not by name. Oh, but yes, they're talking about Delta, all right. The racist, sexist town where people want to be left alone. The elites, recently graduated from Yale and Cornell and Williams College, making burger flipper wages as journalists, will not leave Delta, Utah alone for much longer. it will be diversified, and the reactionary forces lurking here, ready to turn America fascist inward, at the drop of a hat, will be re-educated. Yeah, super passage and illustrative, I think, of the work and where you're coming from, and recommended to all in that sense. Who did you write the book for? Every writer sits down to with a rough idea of who's going to be reading it, nationality-wise, maybe sex-wise, maybe age-wise. Where was your target audience?
You know, I don't think I had much of a target audience when I first started writing the book. I was just putting out some things, that I wanted to say, I guess, and writing the old cliche about writing it for yourself was mostly true. I think in this case, like I said, there was this idea that someone had suggested, like the Tom Wolfe of the red pill or whatnot, and so that was the orientation, I guess. So I in a way, I was writing it for those people, but I wasn't. I wanted it, to hopefully go beyond that, at least to penetrate to a few people who it might really affect their ideas, and their thinking. And so I did have that going on, and there's always a little bit of a fringe, that the book isn't probably for the mainstream. I kind of realized as I wrote it, it wasn't going to appeal to 90%, the population or whatever. So, but that's fine. No book does to everyone, but some books do to a pretty huge cross section. That's why they sell 5 million copies. And, I knew this one, it wouldn't appeal to that wide of an audience. So that's okay.
A theme in these interviews, as they go on, is I'm going to ask the writers to offer any advice they might have to upcoming red-pilled fiction writers, because it is a difficult market for them to enter. Have you got any tips or advice on how to go about any aspect of publishing or publicizing your work, or anything else? Or maybe the advice is not to bother go through the mainstream and just go directly. That seems to be the most useful information these days, advice. Did you have any experiences to relate?
Yeah, well, I will just a couple of things. The first book, I wasn't as technologically advanced on Amazon. I made a few mistakes, during the publishing and so on process. So, that hopefully people can avoid some of those. And I probably would have if I'd really studied it more. But one thing was the cover of the hard cover, or the soft cover version, of the hard copy version of Sanity is different, because the photograph I used was a great photo, but it turned out it just wouldn't be allowed as a cover on a printed book. So
what wasn't allowed?
Well, the file, it wasn't a high enough resolution. The resolution was not high enough, and so that kind of thing. I had to put out 2 corrected versions. I hope you got I think you did. You got the 3rd and almost perfectly corrected version of Sanity, but the first one probably had 20 typos or something like that.
Well, that's quite common because we don't get the benefit of editors and all the backup that a normal writer would get. They have whole armies doing the work, and in fact, even doing the writing in some cases. So, and we're entirely on our own, and it's a shame, but there's probably a market opportunity there for somebody to fill, because we have to self-publish and self-edit and self-everything, by and large, with very few exceptions.
Yeah, well, and that was all right. So I had some friends who pointed things out, and it was very nice of people. A couple people sent me a list of corrections, and I took them at their word and did it, and then found a few more after that. So so that's something I strive to get it the first time, so you don't have to update multiple times, you know, your manuscript, even though Amazon allows you to do that, and it's not a problem really. But there are a few people who bought the paperback, you know, 2 years ago, and I'm sad to say that it is not quite the product that I, you know, later put out, I guess.
Well, we're often overly critical as well. I feel the same about my first, the first versions of my book that went out, but people don't actually notice the errors that we do often enough. I think they play a bigger role in our minds than they do in the readers sometimes. But yes, it is difficult without backup and other people, professionals to help you. And what about plans for another book then? You've got two of a trilogy. It almost demands a third section.
Well, I do have some preliminary work done on a third book, which I'll try to do a little different. It's going to be in sequential in time, and it'll be in the third person, you know, because I think we need to change and not just get stuck in the same groove. But it will be the same universe, basically, and it's going to have some historical things about, you know, the outfit, the 1940s and 50s, a lot of smoking and drinking, you know. That's what I like. I notice in your books, you know, you're not afraid to have everyone smoke.
No, it's on purpose. And drink as well. I notice you are an expert on martinis and whiskey, which is all good stuff as far as I'm concerned. And it is being definitely phased out in the mainstream, these things, in Hollywood and so on. So we need to be a bit defiant about these old habits and traditions.
Yeah, and that's why it's fun. So in the part of the book I've written, which is probably less than 10%, to be honest, of this book, which I'm titling Intelligence, will be the, you know,
Okay.
third book of the trilogy. This is definitely the end of this cycle, but yeah, that's what I'm working on right now, and I expect it'll take months for me to get done because that's just the way it is.
I take it you have a full-time job as well. You're doing this as part-time on the side, the writing.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, never easy, never easy. But well, good for you. Well, that just about brings the interview to a close, I think. If there's anything else you'd like to add, or
Well, I'd like to just thank you for you know, having me on and talking about it. It is a lot of fun to talk about your book, and someday I'll turn this around and I'll interview you about your book. And just for the people watching, his book Lost Causes is excellent. Before I had met Richard on Twitter or anything else, it turns out that I'd read it back in 2019 and
fantastic.
put some good words up, and that was absolutely honest on my part. So anyway, it's great to talk to you, Richard. I appreciate the interview very much.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much for being my guest. And we look forward to doing another interview one day when you've completed Intelligence. Let's see how we get on then. All the best.